I was born in New York City. My father was a letter carrier. My mother was a housewife, but she was a milliner. She worked on fancy hats and fancy downtown department stores. I grew up in the city, went to the New York public school system, and signed up for the military while I was still in high school because the war was on. And I entered the service in '44 and became an aerial gunner in the Army Air Corps. One of the things I remember, of course, we lived in apartments, a middle-class area. My parents decided to move into an interesting housing project that was developed by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, which was an experiment, private housing project in New York, and it was a model. And I remember people coming from all over the country in buses to visit this place. So in my teen years, I lived there. And I went to an aeronautical engineering high school, believe it or not. It's a specialized school because I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. I have a cousin in New York, had a big architectural practice. He kind of influenced me a little bit because he knew that he saw my drawings and he saw my artwork and all that. And he said, I think you ought to seriously consider architecture when you get out of the service, which I did. So I borrowed several important books from him. Bannister Fletcher, History of Architecture. It was a tattered book. It was my first introduction. And so my sketching and drawing interested him, and he thought I ought to pursue this. And he tried to get me into Columbia, but like I said, it was crowded. So I came out to Colorado. But his influence was personal, and just I think you ought to consider it. What intrigued me was my sketching and artistic abilities, at least what I was doing in high school. I was always able to express myself in sketch form. I was always sketching out things and explaining things on paper. And so in doing that and sketching wherever I had time to do, pencil sketches, pastels, and stuff like that, I just did that. And when we were doing the engineering work in aeronautical engineering, there was a lot of diagrams. And I got intrigued with these diagrams, flow diagrams and electrical diagrams, and so all of that graphic work intrigued me. But when he said he thinks I ought to, to consider architecture, I was a little jaded with when you get out of the military, you sort of want to forget that. So I said, it's like Yogi Berra says, you come to a fork in the road and take it. So I decided to go to architecture instead of aeronautical work. And of course I was surrounded by good stuff all over New York, and I just sketched and so forth wherever I went. And then as I was in the military in various places, I became interested in other parts of the country that I never had been to or would have had that opportunity. I saw the difference between living in the big city and living in a little city. Denver was only 200,000 people, 250,000 post-war. I thought there might be some opportunities here. So I said, goodbye, New York, and hello, Denver. I stayed. In 1950, which is about the time I was a senior, I got out in '51, we had the Korean War. Denver was not building anything. It was flat, totally nothing happening. It came to a standstill, and getting a job working for an architect was very difficult. There weren't many. A lot of us worked for peanuts an hour to different firms. I went into the I had a degree in architecture and planning, so I went into city planning office, Harmon O'Donnell, which was a private firm here. I learned a little bit about doing larger projects. One project I remember working on in about 1951 with Harmon O'Donnell, they did land planning all over the city for subdivisions and so forth. And my boss at that time was Tex Harmon, one of the two partners. There was only a couple of us in the office. He came back one day and he said, I went out to visit a project we're doing up here north of Denver. And I said, oh, you did? Yeah. And a big black car pulled up, and guess who was in it? Eisenhower. Bal Swan, president of the Savings and Loan, and his other partner took him out to Broomfield and said, Ike, you're part of this. And I think he got Ike to invest in the city of Broomfield. That was the word that we heard. I went to work for a lot of architects. Worked for Joe Marlowe, which was a young contemporary architect that has done some beautiful little homes up in Hilltop, some nice homes in Littleton. I worked for Jim Sudler. In fact, Jim Sudler was the last firm I worked for a while, and we did a lot of work. And I loved working there, and I worked with my next desk was John Rogers sitting over here, and you know, had all the people that you know about. It was an interesting firm, and at that time, I had some opportunities to open my own firm, and it was about 1956, and that's the time I decided to launch out and open my own firm, and under Maxwell L. Saul and Associates, which still exists in name, even though I'm retired. But I'm retired working hard. It was absolute disaster. Had no connections. I had a few projects to deal with. I had an interesting experience at that time. I just had opened the office up, and I was introduced to a very famous person. I found out he was famous. Came to Denver and wanted to do some restoration of old buildings in what's now called the Golden Triangle. We didn't call it that. So he went out and bought a whole bunch of houses. And he came to me and said, can we fix these up and really do them up and create gas lights out there and kind of really make the street really kind of like Georgetown in Washington. And that was a dream he had. Well, it was intriguing. A young architect, you know, why not? We tested a few houses out. We remodeled some. We went to City Hall and told them what we were doing. They went nuts. They went crazy. They said, you can't do that. This is industrial area. We don't want any housing here. Restoration was not in the cards. Well, anyway, he said, sell everything. Sold it all. Well, this man is famous. He married a lady from Denver who was an author, very famous author. Her name was Libby Block, and his name was Pat Duggan, and he was the movie producer that did The Best Years of Our Lives, which is a great movie that got the Academy Award. And after that, he came to Denver a lot, and I did a lot of other projects for him. But we became good friends. But it was an interesting exercise in how a thing can turn, and what the people at City Hall can do and not do. So we had some leadership at that moment that had some visions of Denver that were, I think, pathetic. Mm-hmm. In 1948, which was 2 years after the school started in 46, we decided to have an exhibit of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. So we did a whole thing as an exhibit. And somebody said here in our committee, why don't we ask him to show up, invite him? So we wrote a letter to Mr. Wright saying, we know that you go between Wisconsin and Arizona seasonally. Could you wedge it in a little bit and we'll work our deal around you? Well, by God, he said yes. We didn't know whether it was true or not, but he did say yes, he would. And we made the arrangements, and the committee went down to the Union Station and picked him up. He came off the train with his wife and young daughter, 17 years old. She was 17. It was a major event for Denver. And he got off the train, he says, I'm here for, 3 days. Whatever you want, I'm at your disposal. We said, well, Mr. Wright, we have this exhibit, and we have, maybe you could do a lecture, we'll bring some people in. He says, fine. He says, but I don't want to talk to your professors. He didn't like professors of architecture. And they were hurt. They pleaded with us to let them visit Mr. Wright, and we finally said, okay. So we ran the show, but we took him up to the Brown Palace, and I remember paying the hotel bill for him, $35 a night at the presidential suite. Cost us, $70, $105, something like that for the weekend. He was with us, he lectured, but the important issue was he created an interest in Denver because the newspapers interviewed him. And when they interviewed him, he was pretty interesting, and he stuck some barbs into Denver, not as because he had never seen Denver before, but his point was all the cities were not any good anyway to him. So therefore he used it as a tool to just needle it. And then what happened was the controversy came to ask other architects, what'd you think of Denver? The art museum, head of this art museum, and prominent architects. And it created a controversy for about 3 or 4 days that lingered. And I have all the clippings here. It's just an interesting thing. And the thing is, he'd never been here before. He loved it. And his wife said to us, he said, you know, I didn't really want to stop. But he said, you made an interesting 3 days for us, and we do appreciate it. I started getting commissions, small commissions, houses, and some commercial buildings. And I worked for, all through school times, I bummed around Europe in 1950, as when I got out I was still in college. I bummed around Europe for 4 months with several classmates, and we visited Europe like you wouldn't believe, for no money. We walked into Le Corbusier's office, three architects, Nate Woolley, Bob Myrn, and myself. They were all classmates. Went in there and said, we came to Paris, we came to visit your stuff. He says, everything I have to say is in my books. He says, you can buy a book from my secretary. So we had a few francs, we bought a book from him, and he signed it. But that was a disappointing meeting with him. But the trip itself was pretty good because we did it and got credit for it. We did a complete history of everything we did. We visited a whole bunch of brand new schools that were being done, contemporary schools that were not being done here. We visited some housing projects, and believe it or not, some of the most dramatic buildings we saw in Europe at that time was crematoriums and cemeteries. The dramatic in Sweden and places like that. There were a lot of dramatic forms that we saw, just landscape work. And came back with a couple of photographs of some stuff we had seen in Europe because it was just after the war. And I went to the Museum of Modern Art. I don't know how I got an introduction. I went down to see Philip Johnson to see if he could get an invitation to see his house up in Connecticut. And I showed him some of these pictures that I took in Europe, black and whites. And he says, I'd like to buy this one. So I sold him a picture for $15 of a print I took in Europe of some, I think it was a crematorium or something. It was beautiful, dramatic forms. I joined the AIA as a junior associate, And I became more involved in the committee work on AIA back in 1952. And we started our first regional conference. And I worked as one of the we did all our own work because we had no office. And in those days, the president of the AIA was given a box of cardboard, a cardboard box with the files, and it went from there to next president and so forth. I stayed and worked on committees, was chairman of the housing committee in my early days. I became a corporate member in '56. And when I became a partner in the school firm of Atchison, Cloverton, Saul and Atchison, I got involved, and I became involved in the chairs, and I was elected president of the Colorado chapter. At that time, the first thing that happened was we had our first convention in Denver, 1966.
Right.
So I was president, and at the same time we had our first major convention. And I was told it was one of the great conventions of all time because it was a very a one-on-one personal kind of thing. We did the thing which you can't do anymore, where an architect would open their home up and invite 6 or 10, whoever they can afford, to bring in for dinner. And you never know who you were going to get. And people came to them, in some cases a bus load, some cases taxis, and we had that. And we had a great time with our big party up in Central City. We took over Central City for the evening. We had something like 40 buses. We had LBJ's barbecue man from Texas come up in the parking lot, did the food. We bought out the Opera House for the evening for those that wanted to buy tickets for that. And every bar in town was open to us. It was a total sellout. And loaded people back in the buses, and it was just a great evening. So the architectural convention was a big success. The big issue was, how do we get the message out that good architecture, good design is important to the community? We had fights with the newspapers. They would never publish the name of an architect. They'd put a picture of a project, but they would never put the name down, or things like that. Things that were irritating, but why did they do that? Why did they do that? Now, of course, right, you put a picture in, or you give a release to the media. Architect's important too. But those were the kind of minuscule fights we had. And then we started some of our awards programs in those days. We never had an award program before that. During the convention that we had, there was a beautiful booth set up by Knoll Associates, which was the premier furniture people that did good design stuff. And I got to know all the people in the Knoll, and I said, what are you going to do with all this stuff after the convention? Well, we don't know. We're going to have to ship it back. And said, what do you have? Well, we don't have an office yet, but is there something we could make an arrangement for? Well, as a result, I think they gave us a whole bunch of furniture, and then I went down to Larimer Square, right down the street here, and Dana Crawford had a little space, and we negotiated and opened our first architectural AIA office in downtown there, and we furnished it with Knoll furniture at their generosity. And we operated there for a while, and it became the beginning of what I consider to be the professional level of our organization. I think that I kind of looked at the little accomplishment that I feel proud of.